Okay, so for this photo, if we go into our Develop tab here, and we want to modify this look to kind of get this blown out area in our sky away, well, to do that, we're going to have to pull back on our exposure slider. Oops. And then once we have the sky the way we want it, to reveal this area in our foreground, we're going to have to pull up on our shadows. Well, by doing that, it kind of removes some of the contrast and crunches up the colors in the photo a little bit. So rather than actually doing this inside your Develop tab here, we're going to set the base look for the shot using local adjustments. So let's head into our local adjustment tab. And for the first area that I want to modify, I'm going to use a lighten for this foreground area. So let's go into our preset styles here, and I'm going to choose lighten. And I'm just going to take my local adjustment gradient, and I'm going to drop this right in the middle. And you'll see that by doing that, that's pulling out all of this light area, and to bring out more of the shadow area, we're just going to modify this local adjustment layer. So inside this local adjustment layer, we can modify all of the different tonality controls that we could inside the Develop tab, but with this, we can modify specific areas on our photograph. So the first thing I want to do inside this local adjustment is I want to remove some contrast to reveal some of this area on my dog here. You'll notice that by removing that contrast, it's really livened up this area where we couldn't really see before. And the reason I'm removing contrast is so that I don't have to pull up too much on my exposure slider. If anything, I want to pull this up as little as possible because it's actually going to bring in more blown out areas than it's going to take away. So now down here, I'm actually going to pull up on my midtones as well. And then I'm just going to pull up on my shadows a tad. And see how that reveals those darker areas a lot better than before? And it's a lot less crunchy. Well, now we can go in and we can add a little bit of true black, just so there's a little bit more contrast. And now I'll go up and I'm actually going to pull up on my whites. And now that I have this adjustment made for the foreground, I'm just going to modify the feathering a little bit. So I'm going to grab my local adjustment gradient again by holding down Shift and hitting K on my keyboard. And now I can pull this local adjustment gradient down. And it kind of removed that super blown out area from this area on our water here. And now we can deal with this top area by using a new local adjustment layer. So I'll add an adjustment. I'll use darken. And then I'll just drop this down. I'll flip it around. And I'll add in a little bit of contrast, pull back on the whites, remove some shadows, and then I'll just play with the opacity to make it a little less strong. There we go. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, actually we can feather this local adjustment a little bit better. But it's doing a good job of just bringing out this foreground area without modifying the entire shot. There we go. So even though we have a little bit of blown out area right here, it still looks so much better than it did when we were pulling back on the exposure and then increasing the shadows. But with this photo, since the actual background is the area that's in focus, we're going to have to modify both separately, just like we did the earlier photo. But with this sky area especially, we're going to have to be careful with pulling up too much on the exposure because we could remove a lot of this detail. So with these photos, when you're shooting into a sky and it's a little bit blown out and you want to correct for your foreground, rather than pulling down on this exposure slider, and getting the detail that you want on this shot right here in the sky, and then going up on the shadows, we're going to use a local adjustment so that we don't have this kind of crunched up, almost no contrast look. We want a little bit more natural look, so we're going to use local adjustment layers instead. So I'm just going to reset this, and I'll go into my local adjustments. And for the first thing, I'm actually going to modify this top area on our sky. So we'll grab a local adjustment layer again by holding down, or grab our local adjustment gradient by holding down Shift and hitting K. And then we're just going to drop this down on our horizon line. We'll flip it around. And now I'll pull up on the feathering a little bit. There we go. So now if I turn this off and on, using this exposure set to the darken preset is really helping bring back some of that detail in our sky. Well, now we want to modify this photo so we bring out the foreground exposure as well. So we're going to do that with a new local adjustment layer. We're going to add an adjustment. And I'm actually going to go down here, and I'm going to go to Reveal Shadows as my preset. And again, we're just going to use our local adjustment gradient, and we'll just drop this down on the horizon line. Then we'll pull up just a hair on the exposure. And now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, let's go into this other local adjustment layer. And we'll pull back on this just a hair. And boom. We've really fixed this sky exposure up here, and we've also brought some detail and some light back into our foreground exposure area. So those are some quick ways to use your local adjustment gradient, especially if you're shooting into a sky or you're wanting to modify the exposure separately. Okay, so the first question is from Ron. How come local adjustments have a default of -1 exposure instead of 0? That's just because more often than not when you're applying a local adjustment layer, you're probably going to do something where you're darkening on your photo, or I guess that's just the most common practice, and that's why we have it set to -1. Inside your local adjustments though, you could go in and we'll add a local adjustment layer. If you want to create one that's just zeroed out, you could just click this to zero it out, and then we could go into More, and we'll go into Save New Style, and we'll just click 0. So now when you add a local adjustment layer, you can go in and you can choose this 0 one, and now all your settings are reset. And Rick asks, how do you deal with clippings? I usually start my editing by making sure there are no clippings. Okay, so dealing with clippings, we'll go back to this photo. Okay, so if I hold down my J key, I'm going to see all of my clipping warnings. So to the left over here, I'm noticing that all of this area is red. So that's showing me all of my true white in my photo. Well, all of this true white is basically all white with no detail. And that can be bad if you don't want a lot of blown out area in your photos. Some photos just kind of inherently are going to be a little bit blown out. But to fix that, you can do that inside this Develop tab by holding down your J key, and then you could pull back on your exposure, and you could remove all of that true white, and then you could pull up on your shadows to reveal the other areas. But I'm just not a fan of how that looks, especially if you go in and you view these areas on this mountain. They're a little bit crunchy on the edges. And so I like to go in, and you can hold down your J key and you could show your clippings, and you could also do that inside your local adjustments. So you can see here that you have all of this blown out area that's white. And what you could do is you could grab your local adjustment gradient by hitting K on your keyboard. You could hold down your J key, drop it, and you could flip it around. Oops. And then modify to your liking. We could just pull down on the whites to remove some of that. Oof. Just like that. So that's a quick way to deal with clippings if you do see them. Okay, so for this particular photo, I wanted to show you guys this just to show how to apply detail with a local adjustment layer. And there's a few different ways you can apply detail. You can do it with your structure slider inside of develop. You could do it with dynamic contrast inside of effects or a tone enhancer filter. But if you are using local adjustments and you're already in that tab, it's pretty easy to apply detail. So for this particular photo, I'm going to go into my local adjustment layer that's added, and I'm just going to click detail. And now I can just use my adjustment brush, and I can just paint in detail. Maybe make my opacity at 100, and then I could just paint in detail, just like that. So rather than clicking effects, adding a filter, adding dynamic contrast, you could literally click local, and in this local adjustment layer, click detail, and then you could just brush it right on. So whatever way works for you is going to work best, but keep in mind that if you are using a local adjustment layer to apply detail, you can't modify the differences in sizes of that detail. So for example, you can't modify your small or your medium and your large. You're basically just applying detail with your structure slider, which is just going to apply a lot of micro contrast on your photo. But another cool thing with local adjustment layers is if you wanted to modify this area with detail and sort of create a vignette around it, you can do that with a local adjustment layer. So if I have this local adjustment layer here and I want to apply detail, I can click on here, or I can go up to my local adjustment gradient. I can go into my shapes here, and if I click edges, and I drop this down, there we go. I can modify this around my shot. And then I can play with the structure and all of that while having the ability to modify the feathering and everything else that goes into this local adjustment. So if I did want to apply a little bit of exposure, I could bring out a little bit of that exposure in there. I could pull up on the contrast, maybe pull back on the whites a little bit, add some blacks. But basically, if I go in and I view this mask, then it's just allowing me to modify it sort of as a anti-vignette, whereas I'm just, pinpointing this area and I'm applying this local adjustment to. But if you're using a local adjustment layer and you're doing this, you still have all of these other sliders that you can modify to deal with the tonality for your photo. So I could pull up on the temperature if I wanted to add in a little bit more warmth to this area right here. There we go. So this particular photo I'm showing you guys because I want to give you guys a good idea on how you can remove haze from a background, especially shooting in Oregon. If you guys are from Oregon or shot in Oregon, it's pretty easy to get some fog or haze in the back of your photo. So an easy way to fix that is using local adjustments. So I'm going to make this brush size a little bit smaller. Okay, so for this particular photo, you'll notice that here we have Mount Hood in the background, but there's quite a bit of haze around him. So we're going to use a local adjustment here, and I'm going to go up, and I'm going to grab my local adjustment gradient again. And I'm just going to drop this down, we'll flip it around, and I'm just going to place it where I want it to be. So now I'm going to put my exposure back to 0, which I could have done with my 0 preset style. And now what I want to do is I actually want to remove contrast from this photo. And I want to remove a little bit of exposure. And now I'm going to go down and I'm just going to pull back on my blacks a little bit. And then I'm going to pull up on my whites quite a bit. And then let's go down and we'll add a little bit of structure. And then we'll take this dehazing slider, which is kind of the key ingredient to all this, and we're just going to pull back on the haze. So now let's go up, and if we turn this off and on, it does an awesome job of removing a lot of that kind of foggy haze from your photo. And the reason that's working is because you're basically removing all of the contrast up here, and you're pulling back on the exposure so that you kind of have a flat image. Well, then you add in a little bit more true black, and you add that contrast back in, and then you use this dehaze slider, which is basically going to remove haze and fog, and it takes away a lot of that kind of annoying haze or fog. Well, now we can go in and we can actually pull up on the temperature slider to bring in a little bit more warmth. And now if I turn this off and on, it does an awesome job of bringing in that warmth, removing that fog and that haze, simply by using this local adjustment layer. And now let's go in and let's actually just fix this foreground real quick. And to do that, an easy way to do it is if you have a background adjustment created already, click into your adjustment, copy that mask. We'll add another adjustment. Let's just choose, we'll click reveal shadows. We can always fix it later. And then we'll click in here and we'll paste that mask. Then we'll invert it. And let's pull back a little bit on those shadows. Maybe add a little bit more contrast and then a little bit of exposure. But now if I turn this adjustment off and on, and I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you'll see with just those two local adjustments, we've kind of set the foundational look for our photo already. And we haven't done anything inside our Develop tab or inside of our effects yet. We've only modified this photo just by using two local adjustment layers. All right. So next thing is to move on to dodging and burning. So let's move on to a photo where we can dodge and burn. All right. So let's go, yeah, we'll start with this photo. And the reason I like using local adjustments for dodging and burning is because it's a really easy way to create contrast on your photo. And if we take a look at this photo, it's already a really interesting photograph. You know, we have a lot of nice contrast in these light and dark areas, and there's a ton of texture in the leaves. But an easy way to create more contrast, let's say, you know, you're editing a photo and you don't really know what to do with it, and you just know it needs a little bit of a pop. Well, this is an awesome little technique to add in some contrast. So we have our local adjustments tab open. And the first thing I want to do is I want to pull out the brightness on the pull out the brightness on the brighter areas in my shot. So wherever the light is hitting this photograph, I want to paint in some more light. So I'll go into my local adjustment and I'll click lighten. And I'm actually just going to increase my brush size with the bracket keys on my keyboard. And I'm just going to kind of roughly paint in some light on these lighter areas on these leaves. Boom, just like that. So now I'm going to head over to my local adjustment, and in my opacity slider, I'm just going to take that back, and I'm going to drop it about 30. Then I'm going to go up to my other local adjustment, I'm going to add another adjustment, I'm going to use the darken preset, and now I'll just paint this on the darker areas on my shot. And now let's head over, and if we pull this back and then pull it up to about 20 or so, and if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, I mean, it's mild, but you'll see that it does create quite a bit more contrast between these leaves here. And you could always pull up on the adjustments a bit more and make it stronger. But just a nice little boost like that can really take your photo to the next level. And it also works great on portraits too, especially in black and white. So all you have to do is just brush on light onto the lighter areas, pull back on the opacity, and then do the same thing with your darks. So we'll do light again. Actually, we'll start with dark. Actually, for this photo, let's actually pull up on the exposure just a hair, just so it's evenly lit. Boom. So all we've pulled up on is our exposure. Nothing else has been modified to this photo. And so let's go in, and we'll use that darken preset, and we'll just paint this on the darker areas on our model here. So now we'll head over and we'll pull back on our local adjustment to about 25, 26. Then we'll add an adjustment, and we'll do the same thing with our lighten. So now if we head over to our local adjustment, we'll pull back on the opacity. Then we'll just pull it up to about 30. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard and turn these local adjustments off and on, it really does an awesome job of adding in some nice contrast to the photo. Especially if we go in and we'll just add a filter, and we'll add black and white. So just an easy way to sort of create contrast in your photos, especially awesome for black and whites because pretty much everything in black and white is contrast. Okay. And a really quick way to actually just enhance the look of your shot is to just kind of change the sky color just a hair. And an easy way to do that is using a local adjustment gradient. So inside our local adjustments, I'm actually going to we'll just keep this one that we've already created. And if I hold down Shift and hit K, you'll notice that it's just kind of pulled over here on our sky. Well, what I'm going to do to change the color a little bit is I'm actually going to bring in a little bit more orange to the sky area. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to head into my local adjustment, and down here with paint with color, I'm going to click to enable it. Now I'm just going to head down into this color picker, and I'm going to choose orange. So now we have this kind of big blob of orange right here. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use our rotating handle to rotate this around, and then we're going to pull up huge on the feathering. Boom, just like that. And now we're just going to head over to our local adjustment, and we'll just pull back on the exposure to 0, and then we'll just pull up on it incrementally. So now if I turn this local adjustment off and on, see how much more colorful that sky gets just by adding a little bit of an orange paint with color? Kind of an easy way to just bring in a little bit more color to your sky, especially if there's a ton of clouds. So just paint with color, drop it on with an adjustable gradient, and then you can modify your opacity. So you're going to get some areas that are a lot brighter than others, and some areas that are a lot more colorful than others, especially in your sky because you're shooting from this sunset area all the way over to the right, basically into blue hour. So to fix that, or to bring in a little bit more orange, we can always use a local adjustment layer. So we're going to do the same thing we did before. So we're going to head down to Paint with Color. I'm going to choose my color dropper here, or my color picker, sorry, and I'm going to choose orange. Or you could always click your color picker, and then you could go in and let's choose maybe this. There we go. So we have that color picked. So now let's drop this down with our local adjustment gradient. So we don't want that. Then we can go over, actually let's make it a little bit more feathered. Then same thing, just head over. Maybe a little bit more opacity. But you can see how easily it just makes your sky a little bit more colorful. And it's really great with places that have a ton of clouds. So if you have a lot of overcast, you can do it really easily with this Paint with Color option. But be careful, because there is a lot of white, your opacity is going to be a little bit more sensitive. But that's just a great way. That's a great way you can just bring in a little bit of color to your skies using local adjustments. Okay, so let's move on here. And I just wanted to show you guys this photo because there's a really easy way you can kind of create a vignette using local adjustments. So for this shot, I really like this emblem. I really like the way the emblem looks, and I like kind of the blurred out look that we have in the background, but I wish it was a little bit darker around it. Well, we could always create a vignette using a vignette filter, but using a local adjustment, you have a huge range of things that you can play with rather than just playing with the exposure. So let's go in and we'll use our local adjustment here, and we'll choose this darken preset. Then we're going to head up, we're going to grab our local adjustment gradient, then we're going to choose shape, and we're going to choose center. So now I'm going to drop this down right by my emblem, and now I'm just going to bring this area in and kind of modify the shape. And I'll just kind of push it right where, just kind of make it around. Boom, just like that. And now I'm going to play with the feathering quite a bit. Add in a little bit of contrast, maybe some true black. And then we'll remove all the structure. Boom. So now I want to go in and I want to bring out the area in this emblem rather than having it wrapped around. So if I go into my mask view and I view this mask, you'll see that it's modifying this area around the emblem rather than modifying the area inside this. Well, I want to modify this area inside of here. So I'll just go over and I'll copy this mask. I'll view the photo again so I can see what I'm doing. Then I'll add another adjustment. I'll go in and I'll paste that mask. Then I'll invert. And now I can go in and I can modify some of these other tools. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, does an awesome job of really just accentuating this emblem right here without actually having all of this area modified as well. So that's a quick way to sort of create a vignette when you're using a local adjustment. And using that vignette, you have a ton of different things you can modify inside your tone and color rather than using a filter for your vignette. Another great thing that local adjustments are used for is fixing skin tone. For this particular photo, you'll see that there's quite a few highlighted areas kind of on their forehead and below their eyes. Well, to fix that and kind of even out the skin tone, let's use the local adjustment layer, and we're going to go down and we're going to select paint with color. Then we're going to use this color dropper here, and we're just going to drop it on a neutral skin tone on her face. Then I'm going to use my adjustment brush by hitting K on my keyboard. Going to make it a little bit bigger with the bracket keys on my keyboard. And now I'm going to head up to my top tool modifier bar here, and I'm going to lower the opacity to about 35. Now I'm just going to brush this on. Okay, so if I turn this off and on, it's a little bit too intense. So let's head over to our opacity, pull back on a little bit. But now if I turn this off and on, the more I pull up on it, you'll really see the better job it does at removing a lot of those kind of blown out areas and evening out that skin tone. Boom. So that's a really quick way to even out skin tone. Just use a local adjustment layer, select paint with color, drop it on an even skin tone on their skin, and then just simply paint it on. Okay, so I have a question. Arlene asks, where did you use the... So Arlene asks, where did I use the color picker to use the color to brush on? So whenever I'm adding on an adjustment and I want to choose paint with color, to choose a color, you can either use it from this color picker option here, which is this box with color, and then you can use this color picker menu. So you could go in here and you could pick your own color. Oops. Or you could go in here and choose your RGB sliders. They have kind of the basic colors in this one, and then kind of so on and so forth. Or you could head down and you could use this color picker here, and this is where you can drop it down on their skin tone. But like I showed you earlier, you could do the same thing with this, and then you get a closer view. Okay, so let's do that one more time with this photo. And with this photo, we're actually going to use it to fix the eyes as well. So another photo with the skin tone. Obviously, this one's a little less harsh, but there's still quite a few harsh highlights on her face. So an easy way to fix that, again, new local adjustment layer, head down to paint with color, use our color picker, drop it on an even skin tone on her face. Now we have our adjustment brush selected. Now we'll just brush this on to even out the skin tone. So now if we pull back on this adjustment and we turn it off and on, but you'll see it does an awesome job of evening out that skin tone and removing some of those harsh highlighted areas on her face. Another thing local adjustments is great for is if you want to apply a little bit more whiteness and detail to eyes, you can easily go in and we'll add an adjustment layer. And in our more styles here, we're going to choose Magic Eye Fixer. And the Magic Eye Fixer is going to increase your exposure a little bit. It's going to increase your structure, and it's going to remove a little bit of haze. So I'm just going to brush this on in her eyes in here. Oops, let's increase our opacity. So we'll brush this on the eyes, and obviously it's going to be a little bit too intense to start out with. But like we've been doing the whole time, we're just going to go over and we'll pull back on the opacity till there's nothing applied, and then incrementally just subtly pull up until you get the eyes the way you want them. Boom. So in just 2 local adjustment layers, we've evened out the skin tone and added in a little bit more whiteness and brightness to the eyes here.